Hey everybody, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling something that I think a lot of people are curious about, especially if you're thinking of buying a house. We're going to be talking about flood zone AE. Now, you've probably heard about this mysterious zone. It sounds a little bit scary, right? Flood zone AE. Maybe it's popped up in your house hunt, or maybe you're just curious about what it all means.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some misconceptions out there about flood zone AE. A lot of folks just see it as a giant red flag. But the reality is, it's a lot more nuanced than that. There are definitely risks, but there are also some surprising upsides that people often overlook.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. We dug into some fascinating research from Better Flood Insurance,
Hmm.
and we're going to break down both the good and the bad about this zone.
Okay.
So, first things first, what exactly is flood zone AE?
So basically, FEMA,
Yeah.
the Federal Emergency Management Agency, they designate certain areas as having a special risk of flooding, and they call those areas flood zone AE. What that means in practical terms is that there's a 1% chance of flooding happening in any given year.
1%.
Yeah. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but if you think about it over the course of a 30-year mortgage,
Oh, okay.
that actually translates to about a 26% chance of experiencing a flood at some point.
Wow, yeah, 26%. That's not insignificant. But hold on, I got to ask, what kind of flooding are we talking about here? I mean, is this like tsunami level stuff, or are we talking about something else entirely?
Good question. So in flood zone AE, we're generally talking about wave heights of less than 3 feet.
Okay.
So it's serious flooding for sure, but it's not necessarily the kind of catastrophic, wipe out the entire neighborhood type of event you might be picturing.
Gotcha. So less the day after tomorrow and more like a really bad rainstorm.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But even a few feet of water can cause a ton of damage, right? And that's
Yeah.
where flood insurance comes in, I imagine.
Bingo. If you're in flood zone AE, flood insurance isn't just a good idea, it's mandatory. Lenders won't even give you a mortgage without it.
That makes sense, though.
Okay.
I mean, you're in a higher risk zone, so you need that extra protection, right?
Exactly.
But I bet flood insurance gets pricey. Is that right?
Yeah, it can be, depending on the specific property and the location.
Okay. So to recap, flood zone AE means higher risk of flooding, which equals mandatory flood insurance, which means, well, that doesn't sound super appealing, does it?
Well, hold on a second. Remember those unexpected upsides I mentioned earlier? This is where things start to get interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me there's a silver lining to this flood-prone cloud.
Absolutely. First off, think about why most flood zone AE areas are near water.
Right.
Oceans, lakes, rivers, you get the picture. And a lot of times that translates into some pretty amazing views.
Okay, I'll admit, waterfront views are definitely a plus. I'm starting to see the appeal. What else have you got?
How about this? Community.
Community.
Yeah, when people live in an area where they know there's a shared risk, in this case, flooding, it tends to bring them closer together. There's often a stronger sense of community. People look out for each other, help each other prepare.
I hadn't thought about that. It's like shared challenges can actually build stronger bonds.
Exactly. And when you're dealing with something as potentially serious as flooding, that sense of community can be invaluable.
That's a really good point. Okay, I'm liking this community vibe, but I have a feeling there's more to this hidden world of flood zone AE, right? Spill the beans.
All right, all right. Remember how we talked about the housing market being crazy expensive these days?
Oh yeah, don't remind me.
Well, believe it or not, flood zone AE might actually be your ticket to affordability.
Wait, what? Are you saying that homes in a flood-prone area might be cheaper?
It might sound counterintuitive, but yes.
Hmm.
That perceived risk of flooding can sometimes drive down housing costs in certain flood zone AE areas. Now, it's not always the case, and you definitely have to do your research, but it's definitely something that attracts budget-conscious buyers.
Wow, so you're saying flood zone AE could actually be a win-win for some folks. Gorgeous views, a tight-knit community, and potentially lower housing costs.
It's all about perspective, right? Weighing the risks and the benefits, figuring out what works for you and your priorities.
Totally. And I think a big part of that decision is really understanding flood insurance, which we touched on earlier.
Yeah.
But our research from Better Flood Insurance really hammered home the point that it's not just a box to check for your mortgage lender.
Right. It's so much more than that. You see, most people have standard homeowners insurance. But guess what? That doesn't usually cover flood damage.
Oh, right.
So in flood zone AE, that separate flood insurance policy could be the difference between financial stability and complete ruin.
You know, it's easy to think it won't happen to me. But remember Hurricane Harvey back in 2017? That was a huge wake-up call for a lot of people.
Right.
A lot of homeowners in areas that weren't even considered high risk got hit with really bad flooding.
It's true.
A lot of them didn't have flood insurance.
And they paid the price, unfortunately.
Yeah. It just goes to show you, no matter where you live, flood risk is something you need to think about.
Absolutely.
So to sum it up, we should all do our own research, not just rely on those flood zone maps, and be prepared, right?
Precisely.
All right, I'm starting to get the picture here. And now I'm really curious to learn more about what communities in flood zone AE are doing to reduce the risk of flooding. What kind of mitigation and preparedness efforts are we talking about?
That's a great question, and that's exactly what we're going to dig into next.
Okay, so we're back and we're ready to dive deeper into this whole flood zone AE thing.
Yeah, I think it's important to emphasize all this information we're sharing. It's not meant to scare anyone away from these areas. It's about giving you the knowledge to make informed decisions.
Exactly, exactly. It's not about living in fear. It's about understanding the risks and then taking smart precautions.
Exact.
Now, speaking of precautions, one of the things that our research from Better Flood Insurance really highlighted was the importance of digging into an area's flood history.
Oh, absolutely. That's crucial.
So how do we do that? Do we have to become like flood detectives or something?
Kind of, yeah. Think of it this way. Past flooding events, they're like a window into the future.
Okay.
They can give you a really good sense of, okay, how often does flooding tend to happen in this area, and how severe are those floods? You can look for historical records, talk to longtime residents, even chat with a local historian if you can find one.
That's cool. So where do we find all this information? Dusty old library books.
Thankfully, it's a lot easier than that these days.
Okay, good.
FEMA has a ton of information online, including those detailed flood maps we talked about earlier. And you can also check out local resources like city planning departments, environmental agencies, even historical societies. They can be gold mines of information.
So let's say we've done our detective work and we found some past flooding events. Does that automatically mean we rule out the property?
Not necessarily. Remember, those communities in flood zone AE, they're required to take those mitigation measures we talked about. So even if there's been flooding in the past, those efforts might have significantly reduced the risk.
Yeah.
It's all about getting the full picture, right?
Right. And that's where those mitigation strategies are so important to understand. And one thing that Better Flood Insurance really stressed was that in some cases, homes in flood zone AE might actually be better prepared for flooding than homes in lower risk zones that haven't taken similar precautions. It's almost like being in flood zone AE forces you to be more proactive.
You know, that's a great point. If you're in a lower risk zone, you might not even think about flood risk at all.
Yeah.
You might not have flood insurance. You might not have elevated your home. You might not have done anything to protect your property.
It's true. Out of sight, out of mind.
Right. Right. Whereas in flood zone AE, there's this heightened awareness, and there are often building codes and community-wide efforts in place to minimize the risk.
It's kind of a paradox, isn't it? The zone with the higher risk designation could actually be safer because of the precautions that have been taken.
It really highlights how important it is to look beyond just the label of flood zone AE and to really understand the specific circumstances of the area and the property itself.
So we've talked about researching the flood history, understanding mitigation efforts, and of course, getting flood insurance. What other factors should people consider when they're trying to decide whether or not to buy a home in flood zone AE?
Well, this one might seem obvious, but it's important to think about the specific location of the property within the flood zone.
Oh, okay. So like some parts are riskier than others?
Exactly. Not all areas within flood zone AE are created equal.
Makes sense.
Some might be closer to the water, some might be on higher ground, some might have natural barriers that provide some protection.
So even within a high-risk zone, there can be micro variations in the level of risk.
Precisely. And that's where those FEMA maps we keep mentioning, they become super valuable.
Yeah, those maps.
They're very detailed, and they can tell you a lot about different areas within the flood zone. You can see elevation changes, how close the property is to water, even historical flood levels. It's like a treasure map for flood risk.
Okay, I'm starting to see why those maps are so important. I gotta be honest, though. They can be a bit intimidating with all the lines and colors and technical jargon.
I hear you. They can be overwhelming at first glance. But trust me, with a little effort, you can learn to decode them.
Any tips for us non-experts?
Absolutely. First, take some time to familiarize yourself with the different flood zone designations. We've been focusing on AE, But there are others, like X, which means minimal flood risk. Understanding what those designations mean will give you a good foundation.
Right, so we can see where our property falls on the spectrum of risk.
Exactly. Then zoom in on those maps and really look for the details. Check out the elevation lines, the markings for water bodies, any special notes or symbols, and don't be afraid to ask questions. FEMA has resources online to help you interpret the maps, and you can always reach out to local experts for guidance.
So it's really about taking the time to understand what those maps are trying to tell us.
Yes, and remember, it's not just about the property itself, it's also about the surrounding area, what's upstream. Are there any dams or levees that could affect the flood risk? The more you understand about the bigger picture, the better your decision will be.
So it's not just about the house, it's about the whole neighborhood, the whole watershed, really.
Exactly, it's about thinking holistically. And that brings us to another important point that Better Flood Insurance brought up, thinking about future development in the area.
Oh, interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, new construction, changes in land use, even seemingly small things like paving over green spaces. All of these can affect drainage patterns and increase the risk of flooding. It's like a ripple effect.
So even if a property seems relatively safe now,
Yeah.
future development could change that.
Exactly. It's something to be aware of, especially if you're thinking long term. Check local development plans, talk to planning officials, see what's in the works. A little foresight can go a long way.
It's another layer of research. But it sounds like it could be really important in making a truly informed decision.
You got it. And this is where critical thinking comes in. Don't just accept information at face value. Ask questions, consider different perspectives, and really dig deep to understand the full context.
You know, it strikes me that this whole process of researching flood zone AE is kind of like being a detective,
Yeah,
but also a bit of a futurist. We're looking into the past, understanding the present, and trying to anticipate the future.
I like that. It's about connecting the dots, seeing the bigger picture, and making smart choices based on all the information available.
Well said. You know, all this talk about risk and preparedness, it's really highlighted something else we discovered about flood zone AE, which is the incredible sense of community that often exists in these areas.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Our source material from Better Flood Insurance talk about how people in these areas often have a remarkable sense of community and strength.
It's one of the most fascinating and inspiring aspects of this whole topic, for sure.
So tell me more about that. What makes these communities so special?
Well, think about it. When you live in an area where everyone is aware of this shared risk, like flooding, it creates a unique bond. People have probably experienced flooding events together. They understand the challenges, and they naturally look out for one another. It's almost like this shared sense of purpose emerges.
And our source material mentioned that there's often a sense of pride in these communities, like a badge of honor for facing these challenges head on.
Definitely. It's about resilience, coming together, supporting each other, finding ways to adapt and thrive despite the risks. It's about acknowledging the potential for hardship, but not letting it define you.
Wow, that's beautifully put. It makes me think that maybe flood zone AE isn't just about the risk of flooding. It's also about the potential for human connection, collective strength, and maybe even like a unique way of life.
I think so. What's fascinating is sometimes the things we perceive as threats can actually bring us closer together and make us more resilient. It's a reminder that even in the face of challenges, there's always hope and the potential for growth.
That is such a powerful thought. And on that inspiring note, I think it's time to shift gears and explore some specific examples of this incredible resilience in action. So stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive into flood zone AE, where we'll unpack some real-world stories and the lessons we can learn from them. And we are back for the final part of our deep dive on flood zone AE. I don't know about you, but it's been a pretty eye-opening journey.
It has been. I mean, we started off thinking it was all about risk and insurance, but I think we've discovered that there's a lot more to it than that, right? Like, we've got these stunning views, the potential for strong communities, and even the possibility of finding more affordable housing in these areas. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Absolutely. But before we wrap things up, I think it'd be good to kind of bring it all together and highlight the key takeaways for our listeners.
Yeah.
What are the most important things that you would want folks to remember about flood zone AE?
Okay, so yeah, I think the first thing is just to remember what it actually means. Flood zone AE. It means there's a statistically higher chance of flooding,
Right.
specifically a 1% annual chance. And we talked
Mhm.
about, over a 30-year mortgage, that works out to about a 26% chance of experiencing a flood at some point.
Exactly.
So it's not a guaranteed flood zone, but it's definitely something to be aware of and plan for.
Absolutely. And speaking of planning, flood insurance.
Yeah.
We talked about how it's mandatory in these zones, and honestly, for good reason. It's like a crucial safety net that can protect you from some serious financial headaches if a flood does happen.
It is, and that's one thing I really want people to take away from this. Don't skip flood insurance, even if it feels like an added expense. Standard homeowners insurance usually doesn't cover flood damage,
Oh, yeah.
so that separate flood insurance policy, it's really essential.
Definitely worth it for the peace of mind.
Totally.
You know, it's not just about insurance, it's also about taking proactive steps
Yeah.
to reduce your risk in the first place, right? And that's
Sure.
where those community mitigation efforts that we talked about come in.
Totally. So, we talked about how communities in flood zone AE, they often have to do things like improving drainage systems, building levees, or even restoring wetlands. And all of these things can really make a difference in lowering the actual risk of flooding.
Yeah. And what's so interesting is that these efforts might actually make homes in flood zone AE
Mm-hmm.
better prepared for flooding than homes in lower risk zones
Yeah,
that haven't taken any precautions.
it's true.
So it really shows that just because an area has this higher risk designation, it doesn't mean it's automatically doomed.
It's all about context, right? The flood zone designation is just one piece of the puzzle. You need to look at the specific location, the mitigation efforts in place, the overall preparedness of the community.
Right. So really do your research. Don't just rely on that flood zone label. Dig into those FEMA maps. Talk to local experts. Get a sense of the bigger picture.
All of that. And even with the best research and preparation, Mother Nature can still throw us a curveball.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think what's important is knowing that you've done your due diligence and you've taken steps to mitigate your risk.
Yeah. And you know what? All this talk about risk and preparedness, it's really highlighted something else we've talked about, which is the incredible sense of community that we often see in flood zone AE areas.
Yeah, absolutely. It's inspiring to see how people in these areas, they come together, they support each other, and they create this culture of resilience.
And Better Flood Insurance actually mentioned that there's often even a sense of pride in these communities, like a badge of honor for facing these challenges.
I think so. It's about resilience. It's about coming together, supporting each other, finding ways to adapt and thrive despite the risks. It's about acknowledging that hardship is possible, but not letting it define you.
Yeah. So it's almost like they've taken this potential negative living
Yeah.
in a flood-prone area, and they've turned it into a positive by building these incredibly tight-knit communities.
Exactly. And they often have this unique appreciation for their surroundings, the beauty of living near water, the importance of protecting their environment, the value of human connection.
Yeah, it's like they found a way to thrive, not just survive, in an area that a lot of people might shy away from. It's really amazing.
It is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on flood zone AE, I think the big takeaway here is that it might not be for everyone, but it's definitely a world worth exploring. So if you're considering buying a home in one of these areas, do your research, weigh the risks and rewards, and most importantly, don't be afraid to kind of dive in and discover all that it has to offer.
Yeah.
You might be surprised at what you find. And hey, no matter where you live, knowledge and preparation are always key when it comes to facing challenges, especially one as powerful as Mother Nature.
Very true.
So stay curious, stay informed, and keep diving deep, everyone.
Absolutely.